There are so many ways that the Vietnam War changed the United States that it's difficult to settle on just a couple. But let me identify three major ways I see the war having changed American society. First, it really divided the country. And in dividing the country, it really caused a lack of confidence, a growing lack of confidence in government officials. And when I say it divided the country, I mean that quite literally. It divided people from one another. It divided families. It divided generations. It divided people of different political persuasions from one another. With those divisions came a marked decrease in the level of confidence that Americans had in their government, in government officials, because they came to understand, at least part of the country came to understand, that government officials were lying to them about the progress of the war. The war became both a political dividing line among Americans and a cultural dividing line. By political, I mean that in a quite literal sense. It divided people over the basic questions of political life. Which political party ought to lead the country? Could Lyndon Johnson as president be believed? Could Richard Nixon as president be believed? There were as many questions about political leadership as a result of the Vietnam War as there were answers. The cultural divisions ran even deeper, because here what happened is that to support the war was to be a patriot. It was to be a true American in the views of many Americans. To oppose the war was in effect to be a traitor, to betray one's country. And that created cultural divisions that were very difficult to overcome and that led to some of the most intense conflicts of that era. The second major change that was caused by the Vietnam War was the end of the draft and the creation of the all-volunteer military, which we have today. It's really hard in an era now when we kind of accept the fact that there is an all-volunteer army. That is anyone who's in the military has voluntarily gone into it. It's hard in an era when that has become so accepted to remember a time when it was equally accepted that young men would register for the draft and would be likely to be drafted at some point in their lives. That every able-bodied man over the age of 18, and in this case it was all men at the time, was eligible to be drafted. This was how the United States had fought World War II, had fought the Korean War, and the draft had survived into the 1950s and early 1960s and was the primary mechanism for filling the troops for the conflict in Vietnam. In the early 1970s, President Nixon began to change that system and to move away from the draft and to what we now recognize as the, quote, all-volunteer army. This was a major change in the relationship of most Americans to the military itself. It meant that by today, by the early 21st century, most Americans do not have any experience with the military. They may have a distant relative who served, but most simply do not because there's not a draft. A third major way that the Vietnam War changed the United States was that it changed politics. In particular, it led to the downfall of President Nixon. The war in Vietnam set in motion the chain of events that eventually led to President Nixon's resignation. The Watergate scandal is complex, and I don't want to go into the details of it and the weeds of it now, but the war in Vietnam essentially created the conditions and led Nixon into the events that led ultimately to Watergate. So it ended the Nixon presidency. It also led to a series of reforms in the 1970s, undertaken largely by the Democratic Party, that kind of swept into power in Congress in the second part of the Nixon presidency, and passed reforms on campaign finance, on how the executive could prosecute wars, how the president could prosecute wars, and a whole series of other measures to reform American politics.